Tonight on Primetime Politics, pipeline politics.
There needs to be significant support, and at the present time, I don't think there is.
Reports suggest we may be just days away from a pipeline agreement between Ottawa and Alberta, but there are still political hurdles to overcome. Among them, objections from British Columbia and even within the Liberal caucus. Coming up, the Ottawa Bureau Chiefs will share the latest. And
it's not an American plane. It's an international plane.
If you make a deal with the Swede, then that will really, really last.
The Swedish-designed Saab Gripen jet fighter versus the Lockheed Martin F-35. Should Ottawa be revisiting that choice? This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, after months of talking, we may now be just days away from hearing about a new pipeline deal. The Alberta Premier has been making statements this week alluding to details she is working on with Ottawa, hoping to have them included in any future memorandum of understanding. Now add to that a new report out this morning from the Globe and Mail that says an MOU may be coming just in time for a UCP policy convention at the end of the month. One that would answer lingering questions about what a pipeline from Alberta to the BC Northwest coast would look like. But even with that agreement between Alberta and Ottawa, there is still the issue of buy-in from both British Columbia and Indigenous nations. Take a listen to what we heard from some Liberal MPs from BC.
There has to be Indigenous consent. There has to be consent from the provinces that are impacted. My constituents believe very, very strongly in those two principles.
You can see that the province and Coastal First Nations have been very clear. They've had a public binding agreement related to the potential of a Northwest pipeline, so I think that's really important to keep in mind in this.
But the government's position has been clear that the provinces have to consent and that First Nations have to consent before any project will go ahead.
So what does that mean for the road ahead? Well, that topic did lead our Bureau Chiefs podcast today. Take a listen now to my conversation with Robert Fife from the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles from the Toronto Star, and Joël-Denis Bellavance from LaPresse. So you get to start us off this week, Bob, because as I said, your article this morning had a lot of eyebrows raised. Talk to us about the kind of details you're hearing around this memorandum of understanding.
Well, there are negotiations right now, and everybody is cautioned that these are fluid. Nothing's written in stone, but they are making a lot of progress. The Privy Council Clerk Michael Serapio has been deeply involved in the discussions, along with Dominic LeBlanc and other federal cabinet ministers. It looks like there's a broad outline that there would be potentially a pipeline that would go from Alberta to the Pacific Northwest. And what they're looking at is, first of all, of course, you have to have a proponent, a private sector proponent, of which there is none. You would have to have buy-in from the coastal First Nations, and there's a lot of opposition to that. But nonetheless, if you want a pipeline, you're going to have to get them on board. It appears you're going to have British Columbia support of some kind for this pipeline. And in exchange, the government is expecting that Alberta would, Ottawa is preparing to grant an exemption to the tanker ban, but only in the area where the pipeline comes out, so where the shipment point is, not all along the BC coast. And there would be also stronger commitments on carbon pricing and carbon storage, which is called pathways. It's a very complicated and very expensive system of taking carbon from the oil sands and putting it in storage, and that is very complicated and very expensive, and whether that happens or not. So this is an important memorandum of understanding because I think from Ottawa's perspective, it neutralizes Alberta Premier Danielle Smith in the way that she can't go after Ottawa's always blocking Alberta. And it also sends a message to the world that Canada is open for business. If you want to have a pipeline, we'll be open to the idea. And so I think from a federal-provincial relations, it takes a lot of the pressure off of Ottawa, and from an international perspective, it tells the world we are open for business. But this is really, in a lot of ways, a fake pipeline, because there is no private sector proponent stepping up, and also because of very, very strong opposition from coastal First Nations. This is a long, long ways from ever being seen, and these pipelines would cost in the neighborhood of $20 billion or $30 billion. So we are a long ways from that. I've actually seen a pipeline built. Okay,
you mentioned the opposition to this. I'm going to get that in a moment, but I do want to pick up on something that Bob was talking about. This idea, because the demand has been from Alberta, from Danielle Smith in particular, that they needed movement on the pipeline to essentially validate their belief in this government. You know, does this accomplish that, Tonda?
Does the fact that they would get an MOU validate their view that federations can work? If that's
Possibly,
the question,
yeah.
You know, that's up to Danielle Smith, and I wouldn't make any predictions about how next week, perhaps ahead of her convention, she'll view things, or how in a month's time she'll view things. Look, I'd say a couple of things. To the point that Ottawa's trying to project with an MOU that it is open to this pipeline and trying to perhaps facilitate it insofar as it is able. That's a really interesting thing. Minister Hodgson, who's leading, who was the head of Ontario Power Generation, now a cabinet minister, the energy minister, who's leading the talks on all this, told us that it will not happen without BC approval and Indigenous approval. So I think that, you know, like all of these things, framework is one thing, and actually seeing it come about, to Bob's point, is quite another. There's a political play going on here on a broader level between the Carney government. He's trying, if it all comes to fruition and there's sometime a pipeline in the future, look, that's a major economic, political, and national unity story in this country, a huge development. But I think we're very far from that point. And it's one thing to set out optics that we're willing to go along with X, Y, or Z, narrow the lifting of a tanker ban, a partial lift, maybe scope out how many Indigenous communities need to be involved in giving their consent or approval to the passage of a pipeline. Those are all big pieces, not to be underestimated.
Yeah. What do you say, there's implications between Alberta and Ottawa relations?
Well, I think it does show that Madam Smith is capable of working with Ottawa if Ottawa sings the right tunes, but there are many danger zones for Mr. Carney. And I think if I was in his shoes, I would suggest to Madam Smith, okay, I'm not going to do the whole work for you. You need to do some homework too. First of all, bring a private sector proponent. Do you talk to BC? Have a deal with BC. I can't do this for you. Yeah. And also make sure that the Aboriginal communities are on board. Find a way to bring them on board. If the federal government does all the homework, you risk paying the political price in some regions where it doesn't work. So that's a lot of danger zones for me, for Mr. Carney.
Okay, let me pick up on the opposition point on that and the pushback on this, because when we talk about this MOU, it's going to be between Ottawa and Alberta. There's no talk about British Columbia being at the table. In fact, we know that there's already major pushback, even ahead of the MOU, from the BC Premier. And I want you to take a listen right now to Jonathan Wilkinson, of course, former Environment Minister, former Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, and also a Liberal MP from British Columbia. Take a listen to what we heard from Mr. Wilkinson today.
Well, I mean, I think the Prime Minister was pretty clear that projects would need the support of the jurisdictions in which they're being built. So I think there's got to be some conversations with the Premier. And in terms of First Nations, I mean, there needs to be significant support. It doesn't necessarily have to be unanimous. It wasn't in the case of Trans Mountain, but there needs to be significant support. And at the present time, I don't think there is.
Okay.
It also, I mean, that's Wilkinson talking to my colleague Alex Ballingall. And what the other point that he made is that it very much puts in play the consent and the approval that Indigenous communities and the province of BC have given to large-scale development of natural gas as a lesser polluting and seen as, anyway, a sort of a lesser riskier option for communities than an oil pipeline and what a spill might potentially mean for the pristine environment that is Pacific Northwest BC. So I think, look, there's a whole bunch of things to be balanced, and what that shows you is that Mr. Carney also has to balance a significant group within his own caucus who will be watching very carefully to see just exactly what Carney's prepared to take off the table.
That's going on here too is that the Premier of British Columbia is proposing that we double oil exports through the TMX pipeline which I think would be something like 500,000 barrels of oil going through there. So it basically put it up full capacity, and then you wouldn't have the need for a second pipeline. And so, and he,
which has it's been floated for quite some time in British Columbia.
TMX expansion or Keystone XL. Like if somehow talks got back on track with the U.S. and somehow the Keystone XL expansion was a route to take Alberta oil out, then you avoid all of that.
Yeah, and Tonda's got a really good point. That may be mentioned in the MOU, but it's still part of the negotiations with the United States, and when they get back on track, that's going to be a pretty big deal. And if she gets Keystone, what oil company is going to come up and say, I want to go through this whole process of a pipeline to the Pacific Northwest?
And you could use TMX to export oil to Asia, and Keystone XL just to export to the United States only. So that would be two pipelines, two different markets that would serve the purpose.
To the U.S. It goes to the U.S. and then on to Gulf state refineries, which then it hits African and European markets. So look, what Alberta wants is its oil to Tidewater. More of its oil,
oil to Tidewater and to Asia, access to Asia. Like, I mean, ultimately, this is a big play because they say the need or the desire is there, or the demand is there, rather, from Asia. They're trying to meet that. But again, though, in terms of the opposition that the Carney government's going to have to navigate, and you know, I was reading the article that you wrote before we went on air that Hartson says it's going to be up to British Columbia and to Alberta to make this work, Tonda. You know, it's still one of those, at the end of the day, the Carney government is going to be involved on this, and the Prime Minister's reputation will be on the line, not only with British Columbia, but to your earlier point, to MPs. And it makes me wonder just how difficult is this going to be for Mark Carney?
Look, it potentially could be very difficult. I mean, this Prime Minister is not a politician. He hasn't surrounded himself with political players, so to speak. Michael Serapio is a businessman. And Marc-Andre Blanchard, who is his chief of staff, is an international lawyer. Yes, he's been involved in politics, but they don't play the political games. And so he's trying to say, look, this makes rational sense to take her off the table and to try to send a message to the international community. But there are constituencies in this country, not just inside the Liberal caucus. There are more seats in British Columbia that will vote Liberal or may not vote Liberal. And I don't think he's taking any of that into consideration. I think he's looking at it from the point of view of the public interest, from a policy perspective, that this may be the best way. I don't think he's looking so much from a politics perspective.
Joël-Denis?
I agree, and so the political price is yet to be determined, but it could be a very heavy political price. We talk about BC and Alberta, but if the push comes to shove, and there's a big push by the Carney government to have a new pipeline, this will have echo in Quebec as well. And the Bloc Québécois will, say this government is not serious about fighting climate change.
In fairness, this is not being pushed by the federal government. They're simply saying, okay, if you guys want to do this, we won't stand in the way.
Yeah, although, on the other side of that, too, you'll hear advocates for a pipeline saying that if this is a true priority for this government, then the government actually has responsibility to make this project happen. How much you buy into that, I think is which side of the fence you fall on. But there is an argument saying that Ottawa has a role to ensure this happens for Alberta industry and the people for Alberta. At least that's the language coming off on the ground.
Lifting the partial ban on the tanker ban, that's a pretty big deal.
And also, I think the federal government is conscious that, the oil and gas industry is a very big part of the Canadian economy still, and will be for this foreseeable future. We want to transition, but it's not going to happen overnight. And for now, conventional energy and new energy is part of the mix. So you have to do something to help Alberta also succeed.
But it's also to caucus unity, because it does make me wonder, Tonda, about the challenge this will be for caucus unity, because bearing in mind many of the Liberals that currently are MPs were MPs when under Trudeau, which was a very different environmental policy when it came to pipelines.
And several of them still hold cabinet portfolios, like Stephen Guilbeault. So he's not the environment minister anymore, but he's the Quebec lieutenant for the Prime Minister, and for now.
That's December. Let's do that in December. Okay, listen, we'll see where that goes. You know, as per your reporting, we could be just, what, about a week and a half away from an MOU possibly being unveiled? So.
Yeah, possibly, but then as Tonda quite rightly points out, we are dealing with Danielle Smith.
Okay.
And also, I mean, I think that the federal government understands that she wants something by her convention date which starts next Friday, I take it. So, you know, and Mr. Carney is in South Africa until Monday. He returns Monday. So there's a small window in there. We'll be watching for it next week. But that's the look ahead. That's my look ahead.
Okay, well, save that for later.
It just shows that this is a political instrument to help Danielle Smith in front of her own members of the party. So is it, you know, public interest policy? The question is open.
I just think there'd be dragons for Carney.
And that was Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Joël-Denis Bellavance, Ottawa Bureau Chief for LaPresse. And what you heard is part of a new podcast from PrimeTime Politics and CPAC. It's called The Bureau Chiefs with Michael Serapio. New episodes will drop each week that PTP is on air. You can get the latest episode right now. Well, to the matter of Canada's future jet fighters now, Ottawa looking at the industrial benefits that any future investment would create for this country. A key consideration as the federal government considers buying the Swedish Gripen fighter designed by Saab versus a deeper investment into the Lockheed Martin F-35. And today we heard from both the U.S. ambassador and the Swedish deputy prime minister. Take a listen to what each had to say.
The F-35 has been a phenomenal success. It's not an American plane. It's an international plane. We had, we put together a consortium, an American-led consortium, 20 years ago. Canada was one of the first to sign on.
You'll meet some countries that sell their products by saying, and I'm not going to name any names, but we're the biggest, we're the best. And then you meet Sweden, and we say, we're smaller, but we're smarter. And I really mean that, because we're second in the world when it comes to innovation. And that also, you can also see that in our defense industry.
Well, joining us now is David Perry. He is the president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Dave, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, in reviewing the Gripen proposal, the industry minister is essentially saying that it does come with greater industrial benefits at this moment in time. And she's talking about thousands of potential jobs for this country, plus an R&D center to be established in Canada. By comparison, how does that stack up with what's on the table with Lockheed Martin and the F-35?
So to answer the question directly, I mean, it's just different because the nature of the participation with the F-35 is different. But take a step back and say that not very many years ago, we ran a competition where we evaluated both of these options, the airplanes themselves, their military capability, the cost of the proposals, as well as the economic benefit proposals. So we not very long ago went and did a comparison side by side of these exact same alternatives. So it's a little curious that we're here now having a conversation about the one that we didn't select being better, because at the time what was articulated was that the proposal from Lockheed Martin for the F-35 was the best one all around. In terms of the specifics, the nature of the agreement through which we're buying the F-35 is just different than most other commercial transactions. Canada's been a member of the Joint Strike Fighter Partnership since 1997. Part of the rules of being a partner of that is that every country was basically allotted work share proportional to the number of the anticipated buy of aircraft for the host nation as a share of the overall fleet. So at the time originally, Canada was looking at, I think it was originally back in the day, 80 aircraft. That number then changed to 65. It came back up to 88. But the basic idea is that Canadian companies are going to be eligible to bid and get work proportional to 80 or now 88 aircraft out of the overall fleet, which is anticipated to reach into several thousand aircraft. The work's not guaranteed, but what it means is that the Canadian companies, of which there's several that have won that work, are providing their part, their service, their component into every single airplane that gets made, not just the ones Canada buys, but the ones that get made for every F-35
So there's a potential
customer.
job gain for Canada when it comes to industrial policy with the F-35 still.
I'd say there's an existing job benefit that's already been accruing and has been for years, and will keep accruing for years to come if we actually follow through and buy the plane.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you say, there was a process about 6 years ago that eventually chose the F-35, but there have been a few things that have changed, namely Donald Trump talking about annexation of this country, and that has had a lot of Canadians thinking about, what is the wisdom of giving billions of dollars into this program, and to that, is there any concern about Canadian sovereignty and autonomy when it comes to these planes? Because, I heard what the U.S. ambassador says, that this is an international plane, but at the end of the day, when it comes to computer upgrades, when it comes to full control of critical systems, that lies with the United States. That's not shared control.
So there's a degree of control that it's difficult to get on a lot of these high-end systems. Maybe Sweden is offering to transfer literally everything for Canada to be able to upgrade, maintain, and operate an aircraft if we get it from Sweden. But we would, for one thing, need to actually have the capacity to actually use all that information and technical know-how, which is not something that we have done for generations. So there's a question about, even if you get the access and you have full sovereign control, can you actually use it meaningfully? The other thing to this is that, so notwithstanding everything that's come with the second Trump administration, I guess my question is, what fundamentally does the government think would change in the evaluation that they did 6 years ago? So again, we went through this long process. This was a very Canadian competition. Some people, including myself, would say it was exhaustive. We went through all of this. We looked at all the facts. So which facts have changed? Which decision-making criteria have changed? Mm-hmm. And while, yes, we don't have the ability to control all of that through that platform or some of the other ones we're buying, I guess, do we really have an indication that we need to have more ownership over that? And are we willing to pay the money to obtain the technology and invest the human resources in being able to manage those kinds of things ourselves?
Okay, listen, quickly running out of time here, but I want to ask you, because it's not as if Canada will buy the Gripens and cancel orders for the F-35. The first batch is expected sometime next year, right? So what is the feasibility of, in terms of operations, in terms of the wisdom for this country, to perhaps have a mixed fleet where, for example, the F-35 might be deployed for NORAD operations and the Gripen for all others?
Well, so again, when we did the evaluation, across the different operational use cases, the winning aircraft scored higher. So it was assessed at the time as being the best military solution, irrespective of the specific mission type. So if you had a second fleet, you would get some basically strategic redundancy. If you had a problem with your other airplane, you have a spare one. But with that would come all the things that come with having two of something. You have to duplicate training, spare parts inventories, your doctrine management. Some of the infrastructure might be different. And so a couple of months ago, when asked about whether or not Canada was going to potentially buy two different fleets of submarines, the Prime Minister, I think, quite clearly said, well, no, because there's a lot of efficiencies in only having one fleet and not duplicating training, spare parts, doctrine, and infrastructure. And I think that logic would still hold even if we were to only just go forward, as you said, with that smaller buy of F-35. I think you'd really have to evaluate what other resources you need to commit to operate two distinct fleets, particularly at a time when the Air Force is really strapped for personnel.
Well, certainly things to consider as we continue to watch the development of this story. Dave, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Great to chat.
Well, earlier today, I took part in Space Canada's SpaceBound conference, an industry gathering that is of particular importance for the Canadian Armed Forces, as space increasingly does play a role in Canada's defense. But what role can private industry play as Canada invests tens of billions of dollars in space defense? It's a question I asked of Brigadier General Brendan Cook, who is the Director General of Air and Space Force Development for the Royal Canadian Air Force.
The military only ever buys its stuff. We don't ever build our stuff. So there's a huge role in engaging with industry much more aggressively on our side. And that's been my mantra for the last year, is a lot of engagement with industry to help industry better understand what we need today, but also more importantly, the trajectory we're going on for what we need tomorrow, which is maybe a conversation we didn't always have with industry. We'd sometimes go, this is our requirement, meet that requirement, as opposed to, this is my use case, and this is the requirement I foresee. Do you think I got the requirement right? Those are kind of the conversations we're having, and actually having industry help shape those requirements, because well-meaning people in the military like myself, I've written requirements when I was a major and a lieutenant colonel, but it was often based on the experience I brought into it and the best reading I could do, but maybe not necessarily knowledge of what is at the very, very cutting edge. Things that are being developed in industry that I don't know about because you're not ready to tell the world until you're ready to capitalize it and turn a profit on it, right? So I think that's having more of those closed door discussions, and that's where I've seen a lot of that happening in the last little bit. And what I hope to do, and what the military certainly hope to do, is it's laid out on our industrial strategy, is actually increasing the level of classified spaces where those discussions can happen, because I think that's an area that we really need to expand into, because Canadian industry often has very good ideas, but you don't know what you don't know yet. I know we can unleash Canadian industry to solve a lot of our problems if I could tell you the threats that I'm actually worried about, not the ones you just read in open source. Because there's a few things that if I could get people in the right room, I know they could solve that problem for me. And as it stands right now, that's a barrier that we are actively working at right now with PSPC, Communication Security Establishment, with Defense, and even the RCMP, about how do we create a framework for having classified spaces that industry can have, not just when you have a contract, but between contracts, so you can develop capability in between. You can keep getting ready. That's because that's what you have in the UK, that's what you have in France, that's what you have in the US. We just haven't had a policy framework to do it, and then we have to resource that framework as well to then make sure we can do it.
So you haven't had a policy framework, although we now have a government that openly talks about a military industrial strategy for this country, not only for its defense but also for its economic prosperity and the spin-offs of that. How close are we? I know what you said, that you are working on it, but how close are you and those you are speaking with to creating some type of protocol or process where private industry can be more involved?
So I'd say we've got the working group is struck. We've identified all the policy gaps that we have. We've created a roadmap for how to close those gaps, and we've identified a couple pathfinders. So what we need to do now is work through those pathfinders, and we'll get some lessons learned out of that. But within 1 to 2 years, we need to. That's the plan, is to have something in place that we can more broadly roll out. But that will still evolve. Once we've got the framework and we've worked through the pathfinders, we then still have to have a discussion with government about ambition. Because this is not cheap, and there is a certain amount of understanding a model. How would we cost share that? It's one thing to have a conference room. It's an entirely different thing for an industry partner to have a classified, secure conference room. There's a burden that imposes on industry, but also a burden on government to make sure we provide the oversight that it stays classified. So within 1 to 2 years, there should be rapid shifting in this, and I would hope that we are getting into that space in the next year or so. We'll be able to unlock some of these pathfinders.
So just a bit of my conversation with Brigadier General Brendan Cook at this week's SpaceBound conference. You can see more of that conversation and the conference itself on CPAC, both our channel and our website. Otherwise, that is our program for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow with Andrew Thompson. I'm on assignment in Halifax, but we'll see you again next time.